Okay, hi, welcome everyone. My name is Jim McCafferty. I am a CrimCon executive board member. I'll be hosting this panel today. I'm an associate professor at Kennesaw State University. Welcome to CrimCon 2020. This is Thursday, stream 3, 2 o'clock. This is a roundtable on racial disparities in the juvenile justice system, addressing racial bias in risk and needs assessment. For the attendees that we have here, if you would like to ask the panelists a question at all, at the bottom of your screen, you'll see an icon that says Q&A. Please click on that and ask your questions, and I hope we'll have time for the panelists to answer them then. But my job is up now, and I'm going to pitch the floor to Ashlee. Thank you.
Thank you, and good to see you again. So I am Ashlee Barnes. So I'm Ashlee Barnes-Lee. I'm actually going to update my name here because I just realized I had Ashlee Barnes there. My name is Ashlee Barnes-Lee, and I am a College of Social Science Dean's Research Associate at Michigan State University in the School of Social Work. My research focuses on broadly identifying and developing and evaluating strategies aimed at reducing racial and ethnic disparities in the juvenile justice system, as well as identifying ways to reduce racial and ethnic disparities in school-based exclusionary practices, specifically suspensions, expulsions, and referrals to alternative schools for Black and Brown students in the K-12 settings. I'm excited to be here, and I will pass it over to Vic.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Victor St. John. I'm a criminal justice researcher focused on mass criminalization, race, and equity. Currently, I'm over at Child Trends as a research scientist. And yeah, that's my spiel for you right there.
And I'm Akiva Liberman. I'm also at Child Trends, where I'm a senior research scholar, and I'm also at the Urban Institute as a senior fellow. And I've mostly been doing juvenile justice research. So I think we're going to try and run this as a roundtable in the sense of making shorter presentations, if you will, and opening the floor more. But I'm going to lead off with an overview of some slides. And let me share my screen. I hope this works. Do you see my screen? Vic, do you see my screen? So for some reason, I'm going to leave it this way. When I do the presentation, if I do the presentation mode, somehow I can't see the rest of you. So I'm going to leave it this way. So I'm going to just provide a quick overview of some issues here in our topic: racial disparities in the juvenile justice system, addressing racial bias and risk and needs assessment. So just quickly, 3 topics that we're going to discuss a little bit and that we want to open the floor up. One is, what is risk assessment? And generally speaking, we're trying to predict recidivism when we talk about risk assessment per se. Some of the issues involved have to do with how do we define recidivism? What's the sample on which the risk instrument is being produced, and whose risk is what's the sample it's being used for? And I thought it was just worth noting that generally when we're talking about quantitative risk prediction, usually they're developed first by continuous prediction, which is then followed by setting cut points for different levels of risk: low, medium, high, and so on. And a fourth point here is just to note that these are predictions and they cannot be error-free. That is to say, no group worth assessing has either 0 or 100% reoffending. So you might have, for example, a high-risk group, 60% of whom reoffend, versus a medium risk group, 40% of whom reoffend, versus a low risk group, 20% of whom reoffend. To my way of thinking, at least, we don't want to call the 40% who don't reoffend, who are in the high risk group, that's not an error. And the 80% in the low risk group who do reoffend, that's also not an error. It's often talked about as, in the language of decision trees and so on, these are often talked about, false positives and false negatives, but that really only works if you only have a complete binary outcome in two groups. So generally speaking, there's always going to be error in that sense. Some of the points of tension in this literature have to do with the use of static versus dynamic predictors. Dynamic predictors sometimes being called needs. It's important, and there's some controversy about what is the goal. If the goal is simply prediction, then you're focused just on risk, or is the goal also to guide case management, which is where you get risk and needs assessments, and you tend to get the language of first, second, third, fourth generation, where third generation is also including dynamic factors, and fourth generation is producing case management recommendations. But that's, different people have different perspectives on this. And it is worth noting that for prediction in general, this is not true in every single study, but in general, most of the predictive value comes from the static factors. And that produces a lot of controversy. For example, in the NCCD report led by Baird, that was done for OJJDP, in validating the risk prediction in a bunch of localities, sometimes they found that dynamic factors being included actually decreased the predictive value of the instrument. So that's a big issue. And finally, we turn to the question of racial bias. A couple of the commonly discussed issues are biased inputs, particularly because there's over-policing in Black and brown communities. That leads to disparities in criminal records. If that is what's used to predict, then we have biased inputs. Then there's the big question of whether there's differential prediction. For example, some studies have found that there's over-prediction of the risk of reoffending for Black men and under-prediction of the risk of reoffending for white men. And that can be true even if the overall error rates, again, using the term error there, are equivalent across the groups. So that's a very important issue. And third, a big one is reifying the bias. That is, whether or not including things that are actually predictive but are based upon structural inequality that increases risk, whether you put that, when you put that in a quantitative instrument or a formalized instrument, are you kind of concretizing that bias and carrying it forward and making it much harder to address? That's one of the issues of controversy. Some of the complexities here, when we talk about fairness, is that there's multiple types of fairness. You might, for example, want equivalent relative rates across different groups, but that will lead to differences in the absolute changes between levels for different groups. So different types of fairness are often at odds with each other. Richard Burke has written about this. It's also important to notice the difference between disparities you see in continuous prediction versus the discrete levels that come out in most instruments. And finally, something that has not been addressed very much, because it's even harder than biased inputs, is biased outputs. If reoffending is being measured by rearrest and there's over-policing in certain communities, and you use that as the validation criteria, you're having biased outputs. And despite all that, what makes the whole area so complicated is that statistical prediction often shows less racial disparity than clinical or intuitive prediction of risk. So that leads some people who are trying to address disparities to want to use risk instruments to reduce disparities, whereas the other issues sometimes lead people with very similar motives to be against using risk assessments. So those are the issues I just wanted to put on the table. And now I'm going to turn it over to Vic, who's going to talk more about racial bias per se.
Right, thank you, Akiva. I think you gave a great lay of the land there. And I want to say for the format today, we want to provide 5 minutes for any participants to provide any questions. You can place them in the chat at this point. We're going to do this at the end of each of our sections. So we'll try to take a look to see if there's any comments or questions being posed. And if not, we can move on to the next section here. All right. So I'll keep this going. So thank you, Akiva, for providing the lay of the land on the complexities and the nuances around risk and needs assessments. It is very wide in scope, and we'll do the best we can today to dive into it a bit deeper. During this part of the roundtable, I'd like to touch on the ways that bias may infiltrate RNAs in practice, focusing on 3 main points. So the prevalence in the use of RNAs, the propriety versus the homegrown RNA, as well as efficacy and implementation of the risk and needs assessments. So to take it a step back, to look at the commonality, as of 2020, all 50 states plus DC had at least one risk and needs assessment available to inform decisions on how to intervene with youth involved in the juvenile justice system. And of this, 82% of states, or 42 states, had a statute or probation agency policy that supported or required the implementation of an RNA for youth who were justice involved. So this includes the SAVORY, S-A-V-R-Y, the PACT, you have your YAZI, you have your COMPASS, all these different tools, right? 42 states in the United States had singular risk and needs assessments tools that are used statewide. So this is for youth on juvenile probation or states that are in the process towards achieving a statewide uniform assessment. So we had 42 states that did this. This is actually a 27% increase from 2013, where we had about 33 states that implemented a singular risk and needs assessments tool. More recently, the state of Nevada, New Jersey, Texas, and Wisconsin were the last to adopt a singular tool. And the remaining states use a more layered regional assessment or a locality administered assessment. And without getting caught up in semantics altogether, that creates a context where a state can have multiple risk and needs assessments utilized across various jurisdictions, essentially. So also important to our discussion today is the source of the risk and needs assessments. So tapping into this proprietary RNA versus the homegrown RNA discussion. And these are the 2 broad categories that I highlight here. Proprietary RNAs are where tools are pretty much purchased and licensed from a vendor, whereas, and if interested, so this is a tool such as the YAZI, again, the PACT, you have your YLS, CMI, the SAVORY, and their affiliated vendors, or Orbis partners, and so forth. And then you have your homegrown RNAs, risk and needs assessments, where the public serving institution, the state develops them, with an estimated 16 states creating their own RNAs here in the US. And it's key to mention that approaches are often dependent on the availability or the allocation of resources that are available to develop the tools and then train individuals to use these tools. And that training becomes important, again, as we talk about implementation of the tools. And without leaning towards one over another, proprietary versus public, the public serving institution creating the tools, the argument here is that the public serving institution, the state, offers a better level of transparency or access involving the RNAs and through the perspective of the public. Nonetheless, there's a larger concern surrounding the validation of the risk and needs assessment being used within a state and across jurisdictions. And at its most simplistic level, validation pretty much helps improve the accuracy of risk and needs assessments, ensuring that the population of people or the data on which the tool is trained upon reflects the actual population on which it will be used with, right? And validation encompasses more complex items, such as ensuring that the cut points are correct, changes in the weighting of individual risk factors, and ensuring that the instrument is applicable for different decision outcomes, right? Like youth probation outcomes may differ from youth outcomes while incarcerated or committed, for instance. And I'll pause here because I do want to make this point more accessible for the youth stakeholders that are out there. And you can think about yourself playing a video game, for instance, where every time you hit the green button, your player on the screen jumps. However, when you play another video game and you hit that same green button, your player may do something completely different because it's a different game. That's the very surface level logic we're dealing with here. So when the risk and needs assessment is developed on a group of people or on data that does not represent the group on which it will be used with, you end up with error here. Again, an instrument validated on white youth living in Seattle, Washington, for instance, may not be applicable to Native Americans living in Suffolk County, New York. And it's surely not applicable to a Black youth living in Brooklyn, New York. But altogether, research supports that tailoring the cut points and the weights of risk factors for youth in a specific jurisdiction, so all these underlying pieces that come into validation, can increase the predictive power of the risk and needs assessments. We can better identify higher risk youth and their needs, which ties directly into concerns around efficacy. So without properly validated tools, the concern is that we run the risk of increasing error in our predictions of youth's risk and needs. In the context of today's discussion, we increase the chance of error, particularly for youth of color, essentially categorizing youth as high risk when they are not. And then the first thing that comes to someone's mind is, why do we care? What's the importance of this? How is this relevant? And the issue here is that incorrectly categorizing the youth as high risk will lead to more restrictive and punitive responses. And to be clear, research shows that more intensive responses to youth who are really no risk at all or low risk actually increases the odds of rule-breaking behavior. So it can have this harmful effect on our youth, particularly on youth of color. And similarly, provision of the wrong services to a youth whose needs are not correctly identified fails to address that given issue, right? So looking at research at risk and taking a step back, looking at the research, it bears that there is support showing that there are race neutral risk and needs assessments. So there aren't disparities in the overall predictive errors across race and ethnicity. However, usually within those same studies, we do observe that there are racial differences in the direction of the underlying errors that do exist. So with Black youth being often over-predicted to be at a higher risk, for instance. And the same researchers often voice concerns about the disparate impact of risk and needs assessments. So we can think of Scheme and Lowenkamp 2016, which is a more seminal modern work, right? And in our view of that piece, they argue that risk assessment instruments, particularly used at sentencing, and the risk factors they subsume have to be empirically examined for both predictive bias and disparate impact. The two cannot be and should not be separated and should be looked at in their totality. So simply put, what they say is risk assessments must be both empirically valid and perceived as morally fair across groups. And again, the argument here is that although some RNAs are fair across racial groups at the overall classification, the tools still perpetuate a disparate impact for racial groups, racially minoritized groups, if not altered to address the race-based inputs. And as to what Akiva mentioned, and not to that, the outputs as well. And I would say, moreover, the disparities at the domain level may also be an issue if they are used to inform responses to youth. So we talk about this overall risk score, but to get to this, there are a bunch of subdomains or subscales used to inform this final score, right? And when we look across these research studies, we tend to find those systematic racial differences in rating youth at higher risk levels and such on these subscales. So Scheme points out in that same article, Scheme and Lowenkamp, what we see across most studies is that the subscale racial bias exists, and to what extent this is being used to inform responses can become problematic. And one of the things that Scheme and Lowenkamp point out is this domain on cognition, on youth cognition, and having these differences there as well. So we can think of implications around that. I want to be mindful of time here and close out. So this ties directly into my final point here around the way efficacy is compromised in this culture of professional judgment, how it can also be compromised. With studies bearing that persons responsible for administering, interpreting, and adhering to the results of the tool cherish their professional judgment over actuarial tools. So biases and errors in judgment, in professional judgment, often result in inconsistent thresholds for services and interventions. So we have the error from professional judgment, again, alluding to Akiva's final point that the actuarial assessments that we use today are better than professional judgment. And more so what we're seeing is this combined use of actuarial assessments and professional judgment approaches, which leave discretion at the hands of the administrator, right? So arguably, and final point, without buy-in and without a shift in how practitioners use these tools, using them incorrectly in some instances, there is potential for implementation error or a compromise in the fidelity in administering, interpreting, and adhering to the results that are found in these risk and needs assessments. Again, this is no simple fix, and it takes plenty of time and resources to get it right. How do we get it right is something we're going to speak about more, and I will turn it over to Ashlee to provide more insight on the future of RNAs. But first, I'll open the floor again, similarly as we did with Akiva, for a few minutes of question and answers. And if we don't have any in a few seconds or whatever the case may be, we can move forward with the roundtable. Yeah, I think we're good to go. Mm-hmm.
Okay. Well, I'll continue the conversation from here. And really, a lot of the major points on this topic have already been presented by my colleagues. And so I want to specifically contribute to the conversation by facilitating a discussion about where do we go from here. And so as we acknowledge the multiple points of tension with the use of these measures, we also want to continue to acknowledge some of the ways that some of these measures may potentially help support mitigating racial bias. And I'm going to talk about this particularly from the juvenile justice system perspective, because that is my area. And I think there's a lot of variation between how risk and needs assessments are used in the juvenile justice system and the adult system, just based off of our view of youth and their ability to be repaired. And that's a little bit different for adults. So my colleague has already mentioned that these measures are not consistently working the same for subgroups of offender populations, whether it's in the prediction piece or the impact on the back end. And I've even found this in my own work. But even with these findings, I'm hesitant to, quote, throw the baby out with the bathwater. If there's evidence that risk assessment because there is evidence that risk assessment can be valuable, it's something that we should try to hone into and enhance and try to figure out how can we make this work, in my opinion. First and foremost, because it standardizes decision-making. So we already talked about exclusively relying on professional judgment being problematic. So if theoretically every youth, because I'm talking about from youth perspective, is participating in a risk assessment interview and decisions are made based on that particular set of risk and needs factors consistently, then there should be less room for bias to enter that process. And I want to emphasize the use of my term theoretically because of my experiences working in applied settings, both as a juvenile justice practitioner, as well as a research collaborator. Things that we want to happen as scholars does not consistently translate in practice, which Vic alluded to. I also want to emphasize the use of theoretically because there's a lot of research that there's lots of validation studies on risk assessment, but there's less research that has investigated whether implementing risk assessment promotes equity in juvenile court decisions. So there's evidence to show that the R&R model, so the risk need responsivity model, is effective at supporting reductions in recidivism. However, there's not as much work really showing us how this model works in the context of reducing racial ethnic bias. So my colleagues and I recently published a paper that examined the adjudication trends over 10 or 12 years in a Midwestern juvenile court. And we wanted to just descriptively examine or understand whether the implementation of risk assessment in and of itself influenced decisions on whether use cases remained in informal probation or intake, or whether they were escalated to formal probation or delinquency, the more formal delinquency unit. And we did find that the proportion of Black youth who referred to delinquency divisions appeared to decrease over time. So in other words, it did appear that the implementation of risk assessment, as opposed to no evidence-based practice being in place, could potentially, influence closing this racial disparity gap. And then there have been other studies that have, demonstrated that implementing risk assessment just in any form, because not necessarily implementation studies, but just looking at using risk assessment can lead to larger proportions of youth being diverted out of the system. So it's not as arbitrary as a judge or probation officer basing the decision on their past experiences with that youth's brother or that youth's parents, or how they are maybe feeling that day, which I'm sure that's not always the case. But we have to be honest and know that sometimes decisions are made based on things that have nothing to do with risk or public safety. And so it's just critical that, as scholars, we continue to move the field forward by examining whether risk assessment actually reduces disparities as it's assumed to, which in 2002, the Office of Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention said, hey, we want you to use risk assessments across the nation because we think this will reduce disproportionate minority contact, but there just needs to be more research to actually test that theoretical assumption. So what is the future of risk assessment? How can we use risk assessment to promote racial equity? Well, as my colleagues and I have discussed as we prepared for this roundtable, that is tough. That is just tough. Risk assessment, risk and needs assessment they're used in multiple stages in the criminal juvenile justice system, obviously. But often, I could be wrong, but I'm not familiar with risk assessment being used with law enforcement. So as far as I know, police officers are not on the streets, using a risk assessment to decide whether they're going to stop and frisk or decide whether they're going to arrest someone. And so, we definitely need to make sure we're paying attention to the front end of the juvenile and criminal justice system, as we know that a lot of the racial bias kind of starts there. But more specific to risk assessment, as we're discussing, as Vic pointed out, there's so much variation. And right now, we don't have clear standards or guidelines on how to develop, validate, revalidate, or disseminate information about risk assessment. And that's something that needs to happen. I believe that it's possible that if we considered using critical frameworks to develop, validate, choose risk assessments with a special attention paid to diversity, equity, inclusion, and transparency, it could be a way to help, close this racial disparity gap. And this is particularly important as we know, fairly recently, a criminal justice reform bill has been passed that hasn't happened in a long time, in which risk assessment on the federal level is going to be required for in efforts to hopefully reduce mass incarceration. And so as these things are happening on the federal level, we can only assume that there will be a trickle-down effect and states will start to want to do things that are similar. And so we want to make sure that, at the highest level, we are thinking about using critical frameworks and thinking about how we tackle these issues from the beginning when we are developing the tools. There was also some conversation around static factors, criminal history being one of the most controversial, because we know that, as Akiva mentioned, that Black and Brown communities or more poor communities are more likely to be surveilled and monitored. And so we also want to consider, should criminal history be a part of risk assessment at all? And if it's not, what are the implications of that when it comes to sentencing? But I would say that I think the future of risk assessment, things that we should also consider is encouraging culturally competent practices that incorporate perspective taking and building relationships, particularly because my framework or my perspective is with youth and families to contextualize risk assessment. So it's one thing to, complete an assessment, check off all the boxes, but without having any true understanding of that youth's cultural experiences or responsivity, that can be problematic. And so thinking about how we can not only just focus on enhancing risk assessment specifically, but thinking about how we can reform the system altogether. So thinking about increasing diversity among probation officers. Do the probation officers reflect the representation of the probation officers reflect the youth that they are serving? Increasing our awareness around implicit bias and understanding how it may seep into the risk assessment process, because although the idea of the actuarial measure is that it's supposed to be standardized, there is still a subjective piece, because there are individuals that are actually having to complete these assessments and complete these interviews with the youth. So one of the ways that I hope to do this is thinking about shifting perspectives about those who are in the system, and by considering strengths-based approaches that measure both risk and protective factors to increase accuracy and potentially reduce bias, particularly for juvenile offenders. It's no secret that in this country, Black and Brown youth are historically stereotyped to be viewed as more dangerous and more violent and less amenable to change. And so in my recent work, I developed with community partners, court community partners, developed an assessment measure specifically exclusively comprised of protective factors or strengths factors. I wanted to know, can we predict recidivism using just particular, strengths measures? And what if we shifted our perspective from focusing on risk and using risk factors to focusing on risk or needs, criminogenic needs, and targeting those and reducing recidivism? And what if we focused on enhancing the assets that youth see that they have in their own lives? So I found that overall protective factors are able to predict recidivism, like other recent studies have found. There's limited evidence that including protective factors can add incremental value, meaning that it can actually improve our ability to predict recidivism. The literature is still mixed on that. But one thing that I found that was interesting and also a little bit disappointing, given my hope that using strength-based approaches could reduce bias, is that the tool did a better job, a significantly better job at predicting recidivism for white male youth. And so when we think about, what does this mean? Well, first of all, I have my own limitations and criticism of my own work. I was limited. It would have been great to think about developing this measure from a critical framework. So interviewing African-American youth, or interviewing youth of color, or interviewing youth that belong to more disparately impacted groups, and identifying from their perspectives, what do they consider protective factors in their own lives, right? We know that from other fields and disciplines that, for example, racial ethnic socialization seems to be a protective factor in potentially reducing criminality, or potentially reducing engaging in delinquency. And so I think that the more that we start to kind of step outside of criminology and kind of incorporate and intertwine things that we learn from social work practice and psychology, or positive psychology, there may be a way to enhance risk assessment so that it can reduce racial bias. But I don't want to talk too much because I wasn't keeping track of time. So I'm going to stop here.
And again, if there are any comments or questions, feel free to drop them into the chat or the Q&A box. If they aren't, I have one or two that I was writing down as we were all chatting as well. So. All right, so I'll throw a question in there. We have some congratulations, and that was great, Ashlee. Thanks coming through here. And I have a question that I wrote down as you were speaking, Akiva, and it gets back to this idea of risk and needs assessments. You pointed out that incorporating the needs in the same tool that addresses risks actually creates more error in the tool use. So I was wondering, what is your take there? Is it that we should have separate tools, like we should stick to risks tools and stick to needs assessments, or yeah?
Well, I think that's a great issue, and by the way, I'd love to hear from some of our other participants, particularly people with practitioner experience, about some of these issues. But I would say, my take on it, which I don't think is definitive, there's a good reason for the controversy here, but I would think that, let me just circle back to something Ashlee said. I think it's almost inevitably always going to be true that the single strongest predictor of whatever your outcome is, if your outcome is arrest, is going to be prior arrest. If it's imprisonment, it's going to be prior imprisonment. I mean, that's the way most measures work, not just in criminology. So that's really important to realize, and that's for two reasons. One is that it's both picking up whatever the true predictive value is regard to the behavior you're interested in, but it also is picking up the same biases on both the predictor and the outcome. Now that might be a good thing, it might be a bad thing, right? If you have, racist cops, then that's going to be affected both at prior arrest and subsequent arrest in a particular jurisdiction. And that's just, there aren't only bad examples, but that's what we're talking about today. Given that, from my own perspective, I don't know what we do about that problem, but I think that risk should primarily, my own recommendation would be, risk primarily be used to determine level of supervision, and needs be used primarily to determine services that are offered. And for most services, I also think that, we have a problem in the world, which is that often the services are only available through the criminal justice system. That's horrible. If you need mental health services and you can't find the funding for it in the community, but you can get it funded if the person is referred from the criminal or juvenile justice agency, that just sets the stage for getting people embroiled in that system. And in general, there's a few exceptions, but in general, those services, especially for lower risk people, should not themselves be a criterion that could allow you to be punished for failure to participate. And that's the other big problem in wrapping all this up together, is that you quickly get into this cycle. You're referred to services, you don't like them, you don't want to go, and now your initial offending may have been relatively minor, but you now get punished for that. And it goes on and on and on. So that would be, anyway, that's my simplistic answer, Vic, is that the risk is best for supervision. The needs are best for then services to address the risk.
Thanks, Akiva. And I'll read out this comment out loud. Someone said, excellent point about services being available only in the JJ system rather than in the community before someone ends up there. And one of the things I want to pose as well, it was interesting as we were talking, Ashlee, I started thinking about the implementation process even further and how this discretion exists so prevalently in that you can adhere, let's say you adhere to the tool and you get your results and so forth, but to the extent in which you adhere to using that information from the tool is totally different, right? So by the time those results get to the bench of the judge, they still have that discretion. So I think there's this almost this accountability piece that's needed, as well as this buy-in piece that's needed. That kind of just resonated even more as you were talking. But something I wanted to pose to you, Ashlee, was about this strength-based approach, as well as you mentioned this like participatory type engagement with the community and the development of these tools through a more critical theoretical framework. And I'm wondering, do you also see in that participatory type development process of developing the tool room for professionals as well, so probation officers and so forth? Because I know we're kind of in this era of professional judgment being mixed in with the actuarial tools. Do you see professional judgment and the community coming together on this and within a critical framework and such?
I do. I really do. And I think, if we think about, if we could just have the world our way, how would you imagine it to be? And I would imagine it being conversations and collaborations with, agencies that serve youth that are involved in the juvenile justice system, school agencies, because they are the ones spending the most time with children, families, and youth themselves. I think that taking a approach where all the different stakeholders are at the same table, developing measures or approaches, because it's not just about risk assessment. When we think about racial ethnic disparities, our talk today is about risk assessment, but it's much broader than that. And so I do think that more cooperation can lead to, or could lead to better outcomes. I also wanted to mention that, one of the I was limited in developing my measure that I participated. So the participatory approach was more so with the probation officers and with the administrators. And so the administrators, their voices, the practitioners' voices were centered in the development of this measure. What do you believe should be included in addition to a comprehensive review of the literature? Unfortunately, the youth voices was not included in this particular, in the development in this measure, which is very important. And so when we start to leave certain people, when everyone is not invited to the table, there's always going to be gaps, because if we don't see the whole picture, we only see it from certain perspectives, and that's where we'll end up. I think this is our 5-minute warning.
It's your 5-minute warning. Thank you.
Thank you. And Vic, really quick, if you don't mind, I wanted to say one thing about the static versus dynamic factors.
Yeah.
I really love that came up because there has been more work recently that has been identified or measuring risk assessment over time, which is also a really important piece that is often missed. So when we look at different validation studies, not often are validation studies actually looking at the validity, reliability, and accuracy of these measures over time. So we have to understand that theoretically, if a young offender is being treated in the court system, if the judicial programs or the probation is working, then those risk scores should change. And so if you're trying to predict future crime or recidivism based off the initial risk assessment score, it's not going to be accurate. And so colleagues and I have examined this relationship, and we have found that it is important to look at the different, like the interim assessments, and use that to predict crime after you're released or delinquency after release. Because if you're trying to predict recidivism after a certain point in time based on the first time point, it's just not going to map on. And sorry if that didn't come out very clear. I'm feeling nervous as I know I don't have a lot of time, so I'm gonna stop talking now.
No, that came across very clear. We need to revalidate these tools because the population is essentially changing. And that triggered in my mind, it immediately went to financial resources, capacity, training to get these things done. And it's almost like, if we're going to shift to using these tools, and we see the increase across states and us implementing them, we need those financial resources allocated towards training, revalidation, and all these underlying processes if we really want to get at disparate outcomes. And we need to include different measures for our outcomes. I love that you mentioned, Ashlee, the disparities in rates, because oftentimes when we talk about these outcomes, and even on a larger scale, I'm thinking about just the criminal justice system, mass incarceration, and so forth, the disparities remain the same. The trend line goes down, but the disparities between Black individuals, white individuals, and so forth remain pretty constant. And I don't know if we really engage that conversation as much as we should. And I don't think as practitioners and researchers, we amplify that and have transparency around how that looks for the agencies and so forth. So I really value that point that you flagged as well.
Ashlee, I wanted if I wanted to ask you if you could say something more about how critical perspectives could influence this. Do you mean something distinct from the strength-based and participatory approaches you mentioned? And if so, could you say more about it?
Sure. And I will admit it's not a very well-developed thought. It's just something that I just started to think about. So thinking about, for example, using like critical race theory to guide the development of a measure. So in which Black youth voices are centered. And so instead of focusing on the larger literature, focusing on the specific experiences of the individuals that we're hoping to serve. And so if we're going back to Vic's point, if we see that disparities are persistent, even though we are reforming the system and we got less kids locked up, this is great, more youth are being diverted, but we're still having this issue with Black youth in particular, then why not focus on Black youth? That is kind of what I meant by that critical race theory, for example.
Thank you, Ashlee. And I think we're at our last minute mark, so I will respectfully wrap this up in adherence with CrimCon's time constraints. And from all of us, we just want to say thank you for attending our session today. Yeah.
And I'd just like to say thanks to the three of you. I appreciate your time and I appreciate your research. Having done a little bit of work in this area myself, I really enjoyed this and enjoyed this discussion. Thank you to the attendees as well for your time and some of your questions and comments. For everyone, the video of this panel is going to be put up on our YouTube page probably by the end of the year, but who knows? It's COVID time, right? So, you'll get a notice about that when that happens. Bobby Tickner is going to be taking over this stream, so I have to log out and kick everyone out. So if you plan to present or attend at the 3 o'clock panel on this stream, you're going to have to rejoin by just clicking a new link. Thank you again for attending CrimCon 2020, our inaugural conference. And I hope everybody stays happy and healthy and safe. and have a good day.
You too. Thanks for having us. Bye.
See ya.